Reverend Kenneth Meshoe is a pastor and political leader. He is a member of Parliament, serving as the leader of the African Christian Democratic Party of South Africa. He is one of South Africa's longest-serving MPs and has been in office since 1994. He has been re-elected 5 times. He currently serves as a member of the Portfolio Committee on International Relations and Cooperation. Reverend Meshoe has been at the forefront of efforts to reject BDS, despite its having been endorsed by South Africa's ruling political party. He holds an honorary doctorate from Bethel College. It's a great privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Professor Ann Bayeski, for inviting me to participate in this vitally important conference on modern day anti-Semitism. I appreciate the opportunity to counter a global assault on the legitimacy of Israel under the guise of opposing racism. I consider myself to be privileged even to counter what the conference that has been organized by the United Nations to celebrate what they call the 20th anniversary of the Anti-Racism World Conference that was held in Durban in 2001. And I consider that as nothing but an anti-Semitic conference. Now we know that Israel has many friends and enemies all over the world, but I stand here today and I speak as a friend of Israel that want to tell the truth about what I know, not only about Israel, but what I know about apartheid. When people talk about apartheid, many of them talk from the influence they got from people who hate Israel, people who have swallowed the propaganda and the lies that are spread all over the world by the BDS movement. I want to say as a start that the political party that I lead in the South African Parliament, called the African Christian Democratic Party, is known to have been in the forefront waging war against the propaganda and hatred for Israel and all the people who support Israel. The anti-Zionist groups, such as the BDS movement, have managed to convince many in the world that that Israel is an apartheid state. Now, I have challenged many of these propagandists to go with me to Israel and show me places where apartheid is practiced in that country. And they have always refused to come with me because they know deep down in their hearts that Israel is not an apartheid state, but it is the only democratic state in the Middle East, and that those who are saying it is an apartheid state are not honest with themselves. That's why in South Africa, the ruling party a few years ago made an appeal to the nation saying, please don't go to Israel. And the reason they made that appeal was that there were a number of people, including their own members, who were invited to Israel, and what they saw there changed their minds. They came back saying, we were in Israel, we have not seen an apartheid there. That is why they went to the extent of pleading with people not to go to Israel, because then their lives were exposed. Now, another community-based organization or an NGO that I've been leading since its establishment in June 2013 is called Deceit International. And this Deceit International has also been debunking the claims of Israel being an apartheid state. For those who are not familiar with this DAISY, it is an acronym. D stands for defend, E embrace, I invest, S support, and I Israel. So both the African Christian Democratic Party and DAISY International have been defending the right of Israel to exist within safe and secure borders with the internationally recognized right to self-defense. I now want to look at the original meaning of the word apartheid and see whether it can be justly applied to the democratic state of Israel. What is apartheid? Apartheid is an Afrikaans word. Afrikaans is the language that was used by a white minority government, and they originally come from the Netherlands. The language is called Afrikaans. So apartheid is an Afrikaans word, meaning a system of segregation or discrimination based on racial grounds. This apartheid was a system of racial segregation in my country that was enforced through legislation by the ruling National Party government from 1948 to 1994 when we got our democracy. What made apartheid different to segregation or racial hatred that have occurred in a number of countries in the world is that with the National Party government, they formalized this racial segregation and enforced it through the law. I'm sure some of you might have heard the word dompas. Dompas meant that you had to carry a special book that would reflect your ethnicity. And Black people had to carry this in their pockets all the time. Only Blacks were having that kind of document. In that document is stated who you were, where you came from, and if I wanted to visit, I mean, this was real bad. If I wanted to visit another Black community, I had to get permission. And that permission would be stamped in that book. We did not have freedom of movement. It was an evil system. This evil system of apartheid denied Black people their basic human rights in the country of birth. It caused much pain and suffering among indigenous people who were the majority. And yet this majority were made to feel like they were unwanted and unwelcomed third-class citizens in their own country. So I want to submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that it would not have been possible to sustain such a wicked system of apartheid if it was not entrenched by law. The police were mandated to enforce it. So those who accuse Israel of being an apartheid state are either honestly deceived or they are victims of propaganda and lies by those who hate Israel for whatever reason, and those who are dreaming of annihilating the state of Israel, which is the only democratic state in the Middle East. Now, for those obviously who are dreaming about annihilating Israel, well, we say they can continue dreaming. Israel will be there and it will stand forever because the contribution they are making in humanity today is immense. They are such an important role player in the affairs of the nations. Many of those who hate Israel, they are trivializing. And this for me is very important. They are trivializing the pain that millions of Black people in South Africa suffered under apartheid. Anybody who says Israel is an apartheid state is belittling, trivializing, minimizing the pain that we suffered as Black people under apartheid South Africa. Arabs and Palestinians living in Israel are enjoying rights that Black people in South Africa never enjoyed during all the years of apartheid. Looking at the original dictionary meaning of apartheid, there can be no real apartheid without an act of parliament. Now, I say those who hate Israel, who call Israel apartheid, and they want to label Israel negatively, they must coin their own word, but not use the word apartheid. Because I was born under apartheid. I know what apartheid is. I've been to Israel more than 20 times. The first time I went to Israel, I went there very, very curious, looking at where I could find apartheid. I went on the trains. I found Jews and Arabs side by side, some talking, some laughing together. We went to hospitals, we went to schools, and we did not see a school only for Arabs and a school only for Jews, as was happening in South Africa. Now, the South African Parliament passed many laws to entrench apartheid in the country. During my many visits to the Knesset, I asked some members of the Knesset, particularly those in the opposition, if there were any laws in their statute books that entrenched racial segregation. And to my surprise, they said there is nothing like that. People have to know, and obviously I'm going now to try and quickly highlight some of the pillars of apartheid in South Africa. Laws had to be passed by parliament before apartheid could really bring the pain that it brought to us as Black people. There were signs all over. Whites only, Europeans only. You see the trains, white only. The buses, whites only, Europeans only. In Israel, I tried to look for that. I never saw such signs, Jews only. I went to the beaches, went to the Dead Sea, saw both Arabs and Jews swimming together. Some even under the same shade, talking and having fun. The problem is the politicians and the haters. A few years ago, I had a friend of mine who was a pastor who visited Israel with members of his church, and he had an accident and had to be hospitalized. When he came back, he said, you know, when I went to that hospital, I also was very curious to see what was happening. He said, his bed, he slept between an Arab and a Jew. There was a Black South African between an Arab and a Jew. And he said, when they would have tea together, he would ask them questions. Guys, I was told that you are always fighting. Arabs and Jews, you're always fighting. And he said, both the Arab and the Jew said to him, no, we are friends. We live in peace. We want peace. The problem is the politicians. So ladies and gentlemen, it is those who hate, those rather than sow peace in the land, they sow hatred who are causing problems. So as I close, because I realize my time is going to be up soon, I must emphasize, Israel is not an apartheid state. There were 10 pillars that made apartheid in South Africa to be so wicked and evil. You had the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, Act number 55 of 1949. You have the Immorality Amendment Act, Act number 21 of 1950. You know, I could go on and on. The Immorality Act Amendment Bill or Amendment Act spoke about you would be jailed if, as a Black man, you sleep or have sex with a white woman. It was a crime. You could not marry a person you liked. You loved, it was a crime. You'd be arrested and imprisoned. So these are some of the things that we have had under apartheid that you don't have in Israel. Okay? You have a Group Areas Act number 41 of 1950. Black people were put in areas called townships. People who, if white people, for example, would like an area that was inhabited by black people, they would remove them by force so that those white people could live in that area. You could not live with them. By law, you could not. So such things don't happen in Israel. You have neighbors who belong to different groups. So ladies and gentlemen, let us demystify and let us reject this lie that Israel is an apartheid state. For us who have visited Israel, Israel is a democratic state, the only democratic state in the Middle East. So may the Lord continue to bless the people of Israel as they stand for their rights and continue refusing to hate those who love them. Let's beat hatred with love. Thank you very much.
Israel's record of racism, violation, and disrespect of UN resolution is well documented. Israel continues to pursue apartheid over the Palestinian people.
Yoseph Haddad is an Arab-Israeli activist and journalist. At 18, he volunteered in the IDF and served in the Golani Brigade, where he completed a commander's course, receiving an award for excellence. He was severely injured in a battle during the Second Lebanon War. In 2018, he established the organization Together Vouch for Each Other, a group of young Israeli Arabs, Christians, Muslims, Bedouin, and Druze. Yoseph has been named one of the top most influential online voices in the Israeli-Palestinian Arab conflict. He is a TEDx speaker and a regular commentator on television networks in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. Thank you very much for joining us, Yoseph.
Thank you very much for having me. So, first of all, allow me please to introduce myself. Yoseph Haddad is my name, or should we say it in the correct way, Yoseph Haddad. I'm an Israeli Arab born in Nazareth, the largest Arabic city in Israel. One of the questions that I always been asked is how or why I'm doing what I'm doing today. And the simple simple answer for that is during my childhood, I grew up playing football with my friends in Haifa, with the Jewish friends, Arab Christian friends, Arab Muslim friends, and Arab Druze friends. During that time, we would play every day soccer together. Well, you call it soccer, we call it football here in Israel. Actually, the most amazing thing is we didn't really care. We didn't really care that this guy is an Arab and this guy is a Jew. We saw ourselves as just friends who are playing football together, enjoying the time. Time by time, we started to become more than just football friends, but friends. And they would come for dinner, and after that for holidays. I've been Jewish holidays and Muslim holidays from Passover to Eid al-Adha, and hosted for my friends, my Jewish and Muslim friends and Druze friends for Christmas. And we really grew up as an Israeli society. We didn't really care, Arab or Jews. That's how we saw each other. So we loved football. That was the common thing between all of us. But also the fact that we were all Israelis. And at age 18, obviously, in Israel, the Jewish people and the Druze men are listed to the IDF to actually serve in the IDF. And me as an Arab, it's not obligatory for me to participate or to serve in the IDF. and I asked myself a simple question: why I'm not obligated to serve in the IDF? And obviously, as I said, I know the answer. I'm an Arab, so I don't have to serve. But eventually, if we look at it, the IDF, it stands for Israeli Defense Force. It's not the JDF. It's not a Jewish Defense Force. And when I serve in the IDF, when the IDF protects the civilians, the IDF protects all of its civilians, Arabs and Jews. And from that point, I decided to actually volunteer and serve in the army. One of the things that happened with me just before, a few weeks before my service, I had a call with one of my friends, and he asked me, "Yoseph, are you sure this is what you want to do? This is the path that you want to take?" And I said, "Definitely, 100%. I want to join the army. I want to defend my country. I want to defend my society." Unfortunately, 1 week after that call, a terrible event happened in Israel. But because of that terrible event, if I was sure 100%, after that event, it became even 1,000,000% sure that this is the path that I want to take. And it's because on the 4th of October, I started my service on the 16th of November, 2003. On the 4th of October, 2003, a female Palestinian suicide bomber went in the restaurant, Maxim restaurant in Haifa, and she blew up the restaurant. Ended up killing 21 civilians, Arab and Jews. At that moment, you realize that terrorism doesn't really care between if you're Arab or a Jew. As long as you're in Israel, as long as you're Israeli, you are a target to terrorism. That's how I started my journey in the army. 1 year later, I became a commander. And I want to put it, we say on the table, yes, me, as an Arab, commander over Jewish soldiers in the IDF. I actually commanded them, and they must obey everything I say. And I'm saying it like this because I want everyone to understand that when we're talking about Israel being an apartheid country, not a lot of people understand and know the fact is that an Arab not only can be in the Israeli Defense Force, but actually can be a commander in the Israeli Defense Force. And he can command not other Arabs, but other Jews as well. So this is very important for me to pass this message. Until today, some of my soldiers that I had back then call me and ask for my well and respect me. And this is something for me, huge honor. And I was blessed to have it in my service. Jumping forward to just about 3 months before I finished my service, the Second Lebanon broke out, and I participated in that war. Unfortunately, I lost 3 of my commanders, 7 of my friends, and 2 of my soldiers, and I myself was injured very badly. It was actually the 10th of August 2006. It was very early in the morning when we heard a huge bomb explosion very near to us. We understand that one of our units, the tank units, were injured badly from an anti-tank missile that hit their tank. So we had to evacuate them as soon as possible, and that's what we did. Unfortunately, the evacuation took time, and we found ourselves after finishing the mission. We found ourselves going back to the shelter daylight. Hezbollah ambush spotted us, and they decided to launch the same missile they launched an anti-tank missile that they launched towards the tank. They decided to launch it at me. I was very lucky that the missile itself didn't really hit me. Otherwise, I would be in 1,000 pieces, but it would actually bypass me and hit a wall that was very close to me. From that explosion, I flew in the air, ended up laying on my belly. I understood that I was injured, didn't really know how badly I was injured. When I turned on my back, I saw that my foot was cut off. Obviously, I started shouting, my foot was cut off, my foot was cut off. I was very lucky that my soldiers, my friends, they evacuated me and rescued me very fast. And within 2-3 hours, I was back in the chopper, back to Israel. And the best doctors, Arabs and Jews, took care of me. And 1 year later, despite the fact that my foot was cut off, it was reattached. And today I run and I play football again. But I want to talk about what happened a little bit before I entered Lebanon, and then just 2 months after that, what happened with a conversation with one of my friends. Before I entered Lebanon, one of my friends called me and asked me, Yoseph, how does it feel to go fight your Arab brothers in Lebanon? And I told him, I'm not fighting my Arab brothers in Lebanon. I'm fighting Hezbollah, the terrorist organization. So this was the conversation between me and him. He didn't understand where I'm coming from, but eventually we hang up the phone, and obviously he wished to stay healthy. He's my friend eventually. But after I got injured, 2 months later, he came and visited me in the hospital. And the first sentence that he said to me is not even hello. He said to me, now I understand. I understand what you said on the phone. And the reason he said that, because during that war, 44 civilians were killed by Hezbollah rockets. 44 civilians. Half of them were Israeli Arab Muslims. When I was in Lebanon, I was defending my country, I was defending my society. On my city, Nazareth, the largest Arab city in Israel, rockets fell down, killing babies, injuring dozens. So when I protect and defended my country, I protected also the Jewish and the Arab in Israel. Unfortunately, we lost soldiers and we lost civilians. But we needed to do what we needed to do. After that, eventually I become, after my rehabilitation, I kept volunteering and speaking about Israel, because it's very important for me, because I see what's going on in the world. The truth between what's going on and the reality of Israel to what's going on the social media, on the news, it's far away from what we are living. And this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. Obviously, as an Israeli Arab, not a lot of people understand that in Israel, there is 2 million Israeli Arabs, that they are not living in Gaza, that they're not living in the West Bank, but in mixed cities like Haifa, Lod, Akko, and in Arab villages, and in Arab cities like Sakhnin and Nazareth. Now, the 2 million Israeli Arabs, and I want to be more specific about why I'm specifically now talking about the Israeli Arabs, because there is some sort of organizations that say that the Israeli Arabs living under apartheid regime, that they cannot have any opportunities to succeed in Israel, that they have no rights. Now, listen to me. I'm not saying that we are perfect and Israel is perfect, but again, we are far away from the lies that they are saying. And in fact, the best example, I always speak about myself, because eventually I managed to succeed. I managed to arrive to every position that I want as a commander in the IDF, as a CEO in a marketing research company, as a CEO in an organization that works to bridge gaps between Arabs and Jews and bring the Arab society closer to the Israeli society. I think one of the most amazing things here, that if you want to succeed, you have the tools and you can do it here in Israel. Just to give you some of the examples, I don't know how many of you, for instance, know Samir Hajjahia, a professor, I should say, Samir Hajjahia. And if you don't know, just Google his name and you would find out that Professor Samir Hajjahia is the head of the biggest bank in Israel, Bank Leumi. If you Google the name of Professor Msaad Marhoum, he is an Arab Israeli doctor, head of the Galilee Hospital in the north. If you Google the name of Bibras who he's a Muslim, and he is the captain of the football national team here in Israel. And we have judges, Supreme Court judges, members of Knesset. Some of the members of the Knesset actually speaking against Israel. Within the walls of the Israeli parliament, they speak against Israel, and they're allowed. We just heard recently about how the corrupted Palestinian Authority killed a vlogger that spoke against the Palestinian Authority. While here in Israel, a member of Knesset, Arab member of Knesset, can speak freely about against Israel. This is the democracy. This is the actual only real democracy in the Middle East. And if we're talking about the only democracy in the Middle East, just a few days ago, I heard that 50% of the new doctors in Israel are coming from the Israeli Arab society, despite the fact that we are only 20% of the population. But you know what? While the Israeli Arab society is succeeding here, there's a Palestinian society in Lebanon where they're not allowed to practice medicine. They're not allowed to practice law. They cannot be engineers. Yes, in Lebanon today, Palestinians cannot become what he wants. He's not allowed. We're speaking about Israel being an apartheid country, while Israel, again, the only democracy here in the Middle East. Nobody speaks about how it's going on in the Arab countries around us. Nobody talks about the fact that if we spoke freely, nobody talks about the fact that if you give a choice to any Arab, in any Arab country, the option to come and live in Israel, they would say yes in a minute, even in a second. So it's easy. It's very easy to say Israel is an apartheid state, but any knowledgeable person or anyone who would come and visit Israel would understand how it's far away from the reality and far away from the truth. And for my last subject before I finish, I would like to speak about just shortly about Gaza and the West Bank. You know, always this speaking about Gaza being under seizure, and the fact is that the Gazan people are suffering. You know what? I actually agree. The Palestinian people who live in Gaza are suffering. They are suffering from the terrorist organization Hamas. I have friends who actually call, who speak with me and tell me exactly what I'm telling you right now. During the last operation, after that Hamas claimed the win, some of my friends in Gaza called me and said, listen, they're forcing us to go out to celebrate. While we're celebrating the destruction, what we're celebrating are people dying because of their decisions of how they actually manage our life. A lot of their rockets actually fell down on their own people, and they're using civilian buildings as a military and as a places to launch rockets to Israel, and actually they themselves put their own people in danger. The Palestinian people in Gaza needs to be free from Hamas, free from terrorism. Israel has not even 1 inch in Gaza. And don't forget, Gaza has a border with Egypt. And if Egypt decided also to close that border, it's because of Hamas. It's very ironic that UN representatives and other organizations didn't even focus on what's going on in Syria, while Israel, the IDF, yes, the IDF itself, helped Syrian civilians, innocent people, women, men, and children, helped them. Yes, Israel helped an enemy country. In terms of medical, we actually, because of the IDF, they managed to reopen 2 important clinics in Syria. Yes, the IDF supply those equipments for the Syrian civilians. So while Israel is actually doing a huge humanitarian act for enemy countries, other people who are so blinded by hatred and in a way even by anti-Semitism, and they're not focusing on the real not focusing on the real problems, rather just want to be biased against us. I can't accept it. I will fight it with all my power, and everywhere I'm invited, I will speak out loud against those biased, and I will reveal the facts and say the truth about what's going on here in Israel.
Since its creation, Israel's occupying power employs an intricate set of policies and practices with the aim of creating and maintaining a colonial occupation and a Jewish demographic majority in the entirety of historic Palestine. Turns a de facto apartheid regime into a de jure reality for all the historic of Palestine.
Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch is an international law expert who specializes in the prosecution of terrorists, the Palestinian Authority, and international law as applied in Judea and Samaria. In the course of his 19-year military service, Hirsch served in a number of senior positions, including head of legal advice to the Navy, Air Force, Ground Forces, and Home Front, and ultimately as the head of the military prosecution for Judea and Samaria. Since retiring from the IDF, he now acts as head of legal strategies for the NGO Palestinian Media Watch. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Anne, for the introduction. It's very nice to be with you. What I'm going to try and talk about today is the idea and the proposition that Israel is an apartheid state, that Israel is a racist state. That is a claim that is often made against Israel in international forums, having its roots obviously in the Durban conference almost 20 years ago. Really, as you quite rightly pointed out, my background is I'm South African. I was born in South Africa. I grew up in South Africa. I experienced apartheid firsthand with my parents being arrested. My mother had previously worked for Nelson Mandela. My parents were arrested for having illegal relations with people of color. I experienced apartheid on a first-hand basis, and I know exactly what it looks like. When it comes to Israel, on the other hand, there cannot be a further reality. South Africa, as we know, was a society, and apartheid was a society that really expelled Black people from the public forum and prohibited them from taking part in any walk of life. In Israel, Israeli Arabs are part of the judicial system. We have judges, Israeli Arabs, as Supreme Court judges. We have doctors, we have lawyers, we have civil servants. We even have at the moment Israel's Corona Czar, COVID-19 Czar. The person who's running Israel's response to the COVID-19 pandemic is an Israeli Arab. In my experience in the IDF, I had a tremendous experience of coming into contact with Israeli Arabs. More and more Israeli Arabs who are volunteering to serve in the IDF. Not only Druze Arabs, but Muslim Arabs, some of whom I had really the honor to serve alongside. At one stage, I was head of the AWOL prosecution for Israeli soldiers who ran away from the army without permission. Under my command were 2 Israeli Arabs, Muslims, who had volunteered for service. One a woman, a Bedouin woman, and the other a Muslim from the north of the country. All of them joining together in the effort to prosecute Jewish Israeli soldiers who had run away from the army. The number of Israeli Arabs volunteering for the army grows every year. Now, as you mentioned, I work in Palestinian Media Watch. And so 2 years ago, we decided to undertake a study of the first Israeli elections in 2019. There have been a few elections since then, unfortunately, but we did a study of the voting patterns of Israeli Arabs to the extent that we could identify and isolate only the Israeli Arabs. What do I mean? Of the 1 million Israeli Arabs that have the right to vote, again, compare with South Africa and apartheid claim, no black South Africans had the right to vote. Of the 1 million Israeli Arabs that had the right to vote, over 50% used the right to vote. Of that 50%, 27% of the Arab voters who are living in the only Arab cities and towns, 27% voted for Zionistic parties, not just Israeli parties, not parties for Israeli Arabs, and their parties are for just Israeli Arabs. They voted for Zionistic parties, Jewish parties that believe in Israel's and the Jewish people's right to exist in their homeland in Israel. 27% of the voters voted for those parties. That's over 112,000 people just in the towns that we could identify as being solely Arab, or the villages that were solely Arab. It doesn't take into account, obviously, the hundreds of thousands of other Israeli Arabs that voted in the mixed towns, that also voted for Zionistic parties, just specifically in the towns that were specifically Israeli Arabs. Now, when we're talking about Israel and our relations with our neighbors and the Palestinian Authority in particular, you couldn't find a more clear diametric opposite. The Palestinian Authority, I will say, and this might be shocking to some people to hear, but it must be heard and it must be said and it must be understood. The Palestinian Authority is today the source of, I would imagine and venture, probably 90 to 95% of all the anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic claims being made around the world. Now let's start first and foremost with the clearest thing, the clearest comparison. In South Africa, apartheid started with the land laws. It started with the prohibition of black South Africans to own land. Whereas in South Africa, that course was taken to a great extent and banned really black South Africans from owning 93% of the land. The Palestinian Authority has taken that apartheid policy and taken it all the way to its final course. According to the Palestinian Authority law, no one is allowed to sell land to Jews. Jews cannot buy land. Jews cannot be sold land. If you are a Palestinian and you sell land to a Jew, the punishment prescribed by law recently, I would say recently, just 5-6 years ago, raised by Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas, the punishment for selling land to Jews is life imprisonment with hard labor, not just life, with hard labor. That is something which is imposed on, sadly, on a regular basis. For many people, the understanding is not clear. For many people, they would like to believe that the Palestinian Authority only would like to take control of Judea, Samaria, possibly parts of Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. But from the point of view of the Palestinian Authority, that is not the case. Their ideology, the cornerstone of their ideology, is that every piece of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea belongs only to the Arab Palestinians. It is Islamic Waqf. This is not only Hamas, the terrorist organization that promotes that ideology, but also speakers of the so-called moderate Palestinian Authority that promote that idea. The idea that Jews may not live in any part of Israel, definitely not in Judea and Samaria. In Judea and Samaria, they're referred to as illegal settlers. So let me just give you an example of what we're talking about. Jews have lived in the town of Hebron in Judea for 3,000 years. When you wander around the Jewish town of the Jewish settlement in Hebron, you go to the central synagogue there. This is a synagogue that was built in 1540. It's been around for almost 500 years. The Jews were ethnically cleansed from Hebron starting first in 1929. Just a few days ago, we marked the anniversary of the 1929 massacre, where Arabs rose up and slaughtered 67 members of the community in Hebron. What was the excuse given by the Palestinian Authority many years later for the massacre? That Jews read their Psalms in a provocative manner. That was the justification to kill, maim, murder babies and women living in Hebron. The Jews were finally eradicated from Hebron, ethnically cleansed from Hebron in 1948, when they were thrown out by the Jordanians who took over the area. When they came back to Hebron in 1967, they were suddenly called settlers. Suddenly, according to the Palestinian Authority, to Human Rights Watch, an organization that ostensibly defends human rights, they are settlers. We're talking about Jews returning to property that had been in their family for generations, to live in an area where their ancestors had lived 3,000 years before, but also as long as 20 years before, to resettle in those lands. Now, suddenly, those Jews were illegal settlers. They were settlers who had been transferred by the Israeli government against their will, against and in breach of Article 49 of the Geneva Convention. This is something which cannot be understood, which cannot be accepted. The idea that a human rights organization would call a Jew a settler, and I saw this recently in a report issued by Human Rights Watch. A Jew is called a settler merely because he desires to own land in the area that was liberated in 1967 from the Jordanian occupation. He doesn't have to live in that area. He doesn't have to be resident in that area. His only desire is to own, is to repossess the land which he owned in the first place and his ancestors owned. For them, it's sufficient for him to be a settler. For the Palestinian Authority, it's sufficient to send the people who would be involved in that type of a transaction to a life sentence in prison. For the Palestinian Authority, every day there are thousands of maps all over in every walk of life, presenting Palestine as the entire area from, you've heard it 1,000 times, the source of the claim, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. This isn't a haphazard claim. This is a claim that is raised and made and has its origins in the Palestinian Authority, because that's what they teach every single day, day in, day out, day in, day out. Every Palestinian child knows that the geographical area of Palestine is 27,000 square kilometers, which is the equivalent to all of Israel. Israel cannot exist. It's not just Judea and Samaria. It's not just Jerusalem. It's not just the Gaza Strip. Israel has no right to exist. And that is the message that is presented throughout. The epitome really of the racism, the idea that Jews have no right to exist in this area. We are adopting, or the Palestinian Authority is really adopting the Nazi ideology of creating areas that are judenfrei, that are free of every Jew. That is their goal, because Jews, again, are something which cannot be tolerated in the area. When it comes to freedom of religion, for example, they are very, very clear about their ideology. They are very, very clear in what they say. For Jews, on the one hand, you have the Temple Mount, the site where Solomon built his temple over 3,000 years ago. That is Judaism's holiest site in the world. On that site was built some 1,200 years ago, a mosque. Now that mosque is referred to as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that's its name, but the Palestinian Authority takes that idea one step further. Whilst the Waqf in 1925 identified the site of the Temple Mount as something which was unequivocally the history of Solomon's temple, the Palestinian Authority constantly refers to the temple as the imaginary temple of the Jews, wiping out is Jewish history. When Jews dare to wander onto the Temple Mount, the Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas goes on television and says that Jews are contaminating the mosque with their filthy feet. Jews visiting the holiest site in the world to Judaism are contaminating the site with their filthy feet. Now, we're not just talking about going into a mosque. The mosque is one building with on the bigger site. We're talking about going into the wider courtyards. Jews obviously don't go into the mosques. But because of the Jews' wish to just go up onto the Temple Mount, they are contaminating their site with their filthy feet. We can't even talk about the right to pray there. That's something which is completely unacceptable. When it comes to, again, adopting Nazi ideology, Jews are seen as something which spreads germs, as a creature that spreads germs. When we entered the COVID-19 pandemic, there were dozens and dozens of caricatures showing Jews as the germ infecting the Palestinians. Jews were intentionally coming to infect the Palestinians with COVID. It had nothing to do with the idea that we were neighbors and going through the pandemic together. Jews were intentionally contaminating the Palestinians, spreading their evil ideology and their evil nature throughout the Palestinian people. The Palestinian Authority is so despises Jews that it invented already for over 25 years a policy that's come to be known as the pay for slave policy. The Palestinian Authority literally has a law which mandates the payment of salaries to terrorist prisoners. The longer your sentence, the longer time you spend in jail, the higher your salary grows. So if you're a mass murderer and you've now spent 20 years in jail, you are entitled to a salary that's equivalent to that of a minister in the Palestinian government. Not only a salary while you're in prison, once you're released, you're entitled automatically to a position in the Palestinian Authority. That position has one condition, that if you're called to work, you actually have to come. But otherwise you can just sit at home and enjoy your salary. The only reason you receive the payment is because you were involved in terrorism, that you potentially murdered Jews, that you tried to murder Jews. That is the only condition for receiving the payments. Just in this period of time, while we're discussing the idea of pay for slave, we cannot not imagine the idea of a 16-year-old boy, the murderer of Ari Fould. Some people may know the name. Ari Fould was shopping in a supermarket just about 3 years ago. A murderer, Khalil Jabarin, 16 years old, came up behind him with a massive butcher's knife and stabbed him, fatally wounding him, and Ari died at the scene. That was just about three years ago. And for that, Khalil Jabarin is about to receive a pay rise of almost 33%, a pay rise just for having spent 3 years now in jail. When he reaches 5 years in jail, he'll receive another pay rise of 100%. And so over time, that salary will go up. You cannot say this is a welfare payment. Jabarin did not support his family. Both of his parents work. They support themselves. He was 16-year-old. He has brothers. He has sisters. Nothing of the house, of the running of the house, was dependent on Khalil Jabarin. The payment that he receives from the Palestinian Authority is merely as a reward for his acts of terrorism. Now, when Khalil Jabarin was arrested, the world jumps onto the subject, saying that there's arbitrary arrests. UNICEF on the one hand, Human Rights Watch on the other hand, all claim that Israel arbitrarily arrests Palestinian minors. For many years, I dealt with that subject while I was in the army, and now I'm continuing to deal with that subject. Khalil Jabarin was arrested. For organizations like UNICEF, his prosecution in the military courts is nothing shorter than a war crime. But what do you suggest you do with Khalil Jabarin, the 16-year-old who just murdered Ari Fould? What do you do with Murad Adais, who murdered Daphne Meir, a nurse, one of these angels working amongst us? The Palestinian Authority tries to claim, and many organizations try to adopt that claim, that these terrorists are prisoners of war. They try to really impose the Third Geneva Convention on these terrorists, claiming that they're entitled to the rights of real soldiers fighting other real soldiers. But that's not the truth. We're talking about terrorists attacking civilians, murdering babies, murdering women, the murderers of the Fogel family, 2 civilians, mother, father, and their children, including baby Haddad, 6 months old, decapitated by a 17-year-old terrorist and his 19-year-old cousin. These are not prisoners of war. The claims that Israel then carries out medical experiments on these prisoners. Again, that idea of constantly equating Israel and its practices to the Nazis and their practices to what happened in Auschwitz. What the Nazis did to the Jews, claim the Palestinian Authority, the Jews are now doing to the Palestinians. They don't mention in any way, shape, or form, for example, that the Palestinian terrorist prisoners received COVID vaccinations from Israel, in many cases, before the families of the victims that they murdered, because they were a higher level of risk, and therefore they received the vaccines. The families weren't at such a risk, and therefore were not entitled to the vaccine. When you compare Israel to the Palestinian Authority, you see that Israel is a society into which the Arab population is integrated and has growing integration every single day. We recently had riots from some of the Israeli Arabs, but that was really the exception to the rule. Every day you see more and more Israeli Arabs taking up senior positions and just regular positions in Israeli society. By contrast, every single day you see the messaging of the Palestinian Authority, which is very, very clear. Jews have no right to exist in Judea and Samaria. Jews are the source of all evil. Jews spread germs. The conclusion of what I would like to argue is that whilst in Israel, Israeli Arabs are integrating more and more every day into Israeli society, holding senior positions, holding regular positions in every single walk of life, as doctors, as lawyers, as judges, even in the IDF. By contrast, the Palestinian Authority on a daily basis is promoting an idea that denies Israel's right to exist, that demands that Israel be eradicated from the map, that Palestine, from the river to the sea, be freed from every Israeli presence. That is the epitome of the racism that we're expressing, that they're expressing, and that we're seeing. Nothing in Israel has any comparison.
We'll do our utmost to preserve and to maintain and to further strengthen the issue of Palestine in this document, in the Durban document.
We strongly urge state representatives to clearly and definitively emphasize the core source of Israeli aggression towards the Palestinians. Specifically, we want to reaffirm that institutionalized discrimination on the grounds of nationality, ethnicity, race, and religion constitute a root cause .
Let us not forget that the DTPA also expressed its concern regarding the plight of the Palestinian people under foreign occupation.
Gadi Yevarkan is a member of the Knesset, Israel's parliament. He made Aliyah to Israel from Ethiopia in 1991 when he was 10 years old. He served in an elite unit of the Israel Defense Forces and is a major in the Army Reserves. As a member of the Likud political party, M.K. Yevarkan served as the Deputy Minister of Public Security. He currently holds the position of Chairman of the Knesset Caucus to combat defamation, delegitimization, and the BDS movement. Thank you so much, Mr. Yevarkan, for joining us today.
Thank you, Anne, and dear friends. It is an honor to share some of my ideas on this critical issue. And today, I will speak truth to propaganda because moral clarity rests on truth. Today, in Durban 20th anniversary, I have come to tell you the truth about the United Nations Conference Against Racism. It is true that Durban was not and is not a conference for human rights. It is a crucifixion of Jewish human rights. And Durban is a moral embarrassment for United Nations itself. Yes, my friends, these are strong words, and I say them to tell a bigger truth about the United Nations defamation and demonization of my people, the Jewish people, and my home, Israel. The truth is that Durban has imposed apartheid against the only Jewish and democratic state in the world located in the middle of the Arab-Muslim Middle East. And sadly, Durban is not Semitic because it only targets the Jewish state and no other with the apartheid label. Durban has used and abused the suffering of millions of black South African victims of apartheid by racializing Israel. Durban is not a conference against racism. It is a racist conference against sovereign Jews. It would be funny if it was not so sad. Simply said, the apartheid label of Israel is identity politics and an example of the new Marxism in the West. And today, apartheid label has deep roots in Soviet and PLO propaganda against Israel. Way back in 1961, PLO founder Ahmad Shukeri accused Israel of apartheid. And later, in 1974, PLO chairman Yasser Arafat compared Israel to apartheid South Africa from the United Nations podium. This was the same terrorist Arafat who killed thousands of innocent people, including Americans and American diplomats such Ambassador Cleo Noel. And in 1975, Arafat and his Soviet paymasters pushed the big lie, the Zionism is Racism Resolution, which stood until 1991. For many years, the United Nations has promoted fake apartheid against Israel, the only democratic country in the Middle East that guarantees by law freedom for every Jewish, Muslim, and Christian citizen. The irony is this: in countries like Jordan and Egypt, Islamist parties are outlawed. But in Israel, an Islamist party is making laws in Israel's parliament and is a partner in Israel's government. My friends, wake up. The apartheid anti-Semitites know the truth about Israel democracy. They know that Israel has Arab high court judges, Arab government ministers, and many Arab Knesset members. Right now, Ebitstam Marana, an Arab woman member of Knesset, is the deputy head of the the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee of the Knesset. They also know that Arabs make up about 25% of Israel's doctors and nurses. And here is the irony. Palestinian leaders and their families who label Israel with apartheid receive medical treatment in Israel. Just ask the families of Saib Arikat, Mahmoud Abbas, and even Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh. So we know what fake apartheid is. Let's talk about real apartheid. Palestinian gender apartheid forces young Palestinians to escape the PA and seek refuge in Tel Aviv. Palestinian economic apartheid dooms Palestinians to death for selling land to Jews. Palestinian religious apartheid has forced Christians to flee their homes in Bethlehem and Gaza. There is apartheid everywhere in the Middle East, except for Israel. But do you know what's funny? Groups like Human Rights Watch and their fans, like Ben and Jerry, cannot tell the difference between real apartheid and fake apartheid. In the West Bank, 99% of Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria live under the Palestinian Authority according to the Oslo Accords, which were guaranteed by the United Nations itself. And since Oslo, the Palestinians have rejected 6 offers for peace. How blind can the United Nations be to history, to Israel's legal rights and geography? Let me tell you, the United Nations has just as blind to mass murder and apartheid for decades in Rwanda, Kosovo, and Somalia. United Nations is silent on the Taliban's gender and religious apartheid in Afghanistan, and we see that tragedy today. What about Iranians' discrimination and oppression of its own people and other it occupies in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen? And let's remember United Nations hypocrisy in North Korea and China. Today, the United Nations has failed in its original mission to advance peace and security for all nations. Israel has taken up that mission. The United Nations should open its eyes to the Abraham Accords and a new Middle East of peace and normalization between Arab states and Israel. Sadly, the Palestinian leadership has BDS its Arab neighbors for embracing Israel and peace. Has the United Nations said a word? But Israel's Arab neighbors know the truth. They know Israel is not the problem in the Middle East. Israel is the solution for the Middle East. Will the United Nations atone for Durban's moral mistake? In the meantime, the truth stands with Israel. Israel will continue making new friends and fighting enemies, old and new. I sense blessing of peace from Jerusalem, the capital of the Jewish nation. Thank you very much, and God bless you. Am Israel Chai.